In chapter 37, we make a transition from the Jacob narrative to the Joseph narrative, and we're going to be in the Joseph narrative predominantly, I suppose, until the end of Genesis. That's, of course, how Genesis ends. And there's a lot of historical things that go into this, and I think we'll have some interesting things to talk about tonight with these couple of chapters. It is important for us to realize that the Bible, as it was composed and as it was arranged, was done so in a particular way for a particular reason. We're going to see tonight one chapter in particular, chapter 38, that has nothing to do with Joseph. And most people wonder why that chapter was even included in the Bible, but I think that we can argue pretty effectively that that chapter is very important, and when you lay it alongside, or beside, I should say, chapter 39, it seems to give a really big parallel and contrast to the Joseph saga. So we'll buckle up here and rock and roll as we begin thinking about Joseph. Now in chapter 37, we're introduced to Joseph. We've met Joseph before only by name, not really as a character. Joseph is the oldest son of Rachel. Jacob and Rachel have two sons together, Joseph and Benjamin, both of whom are in some way loved more than the other sons. And we noticed when we looked at the genealogy and the lineage from the four wives of Jacob that it's the line of Leah that produces the line of kings and the line of priests, Judah and Levi among others. And that the line of such specialness comes through the line of the unloved. Remember, Jacob loved Rachel more than he loved Leah. And so Joseph comes on the scene, and we meet him in chapter 37 when he's 17 years old. Now, one thing that maybe we need to take notice of is you don't really see this in your Hebrew or in your English Bible, but in the Hebrew text, it is very apparent, and we need to do a little bit of a word study. In verse 2, Joseph is called, in Hebrew, the word is Na'ar. In your English Bible, it might say that he's a youngster or a young man or a youth or something like that. And the problem is the meaning of this word, just admittedly, is very uncertain. Scholars still debate today what this word means. And I know that firsthand because the very first assignment that I had in a PhD class was to write a paper about the meaning of the word Na'ar. And then we all got told how wrong we were. So I don't necessarily have all the answers, but I do think it's interesting because most of our English Bibles will translate this word as youth or young man or something like that. It's a masculine word, and there's a feminine form that could mean young woman as well. But the problem with that is this word is used of Moses when Moses is a baby. Okay, well that's about as young man can get. It's used of Joseph here when he's 17. It's used of the Israelite military. When the military, in order to fight in the military, you have to be at least 20 years of age or older. It's also used of, I think, Moses also, but I may be mistaken on this. I need to go back and do my study. But it's used of a character in the Old Testament when that character is 90 years old. Now, no offense to the aged, but I'm not so sure that 90 years old is a young man. And so it cannot mean age. It can't denote age. So what does it do? What's the purpose of this word? Well, as best as I can tell, and what most scholars tend to agree on, is that this word is not necessarily to describe the age or the lifespan of a person, but to talk about the role that that person has in society. And so a better term for this, I don't know how you translate this into one word at all, but usually when this word comes up, it's recognizing the role of the person as either a prince, or maybe in the feminine, a princess, who is relatively new at their job. And so I like to think of it, if I'm having a one-word equivalence in translation, I like to think of it as a novice. And a novice is different than a young man, okay, or a young woman. You can be old and still be new at something. That's the beauty of life. So what I'm taking all that time to say about Joseph is that Joseph is a new person to his role. Now the question then becomes, what is his role? Well, his role is something that should not have been his role. His role is to be an overseer and some kind of a reporter for his brothers. His brothers are out actually in the fields, they're out with the animals working and doing the grunt work, and Joseph is just going and bringing report. Now, in a patriarchal, hierarchical system, it is the oldest who has the role of privilege. And yet here Joseph is the second youngest. Of course, Benjamin is going to be very young and not able to do anything at this point, it seems. But so Joseph is the youngest of his brothers, at least that are old enough to work. And yet he doesn't have to do that at all. And so the story goes that the brothers were out working, and Joseph brought back a bad report to his father Jacob. And after Joseph does this, the Bible says that his brothers hated him. Now you say, well, hate is a strong word. Yeah, and that's the word that's used here in the text. And I believe that the text means what it says. So our question then might become, why did Joseph's brothers dislike him so much? What was the problem there? Well, there's a couple of things. Number one, I've read in commentaries before and even heard preachers say, outside of Jesus, Joseph is the only character in the entire Bible of which nothing bad is said. At least major character. Okay? So, is that true? Well, it depends on how you interpret it. Joseph seems to be some kind of a tattletale. It's like he's always waiting for his brothers to mess up, or he's very critical of his brothers. Maybe he thinks that he knows how he can do his job better. Some of y'all may know what that's like. Maybe at work, you have someone who comes in who maybe is in an entry-level position telling you how to do your job, and that can get very frustrating very fast. Maybe that's how they felt. Joseph was a tattletale. He was always telling the father something different, telling Jacob something negative about them. He did not obey the conventional standards of the family hierarchy. Joseph is given a coat, a tunic of some kind, by his father. Now, in your English Bibles, it might say a multicolored tunic or the coat of many colors, as many of us grew up hearing about it and knowing it. And the picture here even symbolizes a coat of many colors. I don't know of any critical scholar today who believes that that is an accurate translation. First of all, to develop a cloak of many colors would have been very difficult in that day. You could dye it one color or another, and maybe it was a royal blue or a purple kind of color signifying royalty of some kind or a place of prominence. Maybe, we don't know. Color might have been a part of it, but probably what this word signifies is that it was a long sleeve tunic. Now, what's so important about a long sleeve tunic? Well, when you're working, especially out in the heat with animals, most of the work tunics would have been sleeveless or at least short sleeve, maybe just covering the shoulder. A long sleeve tunic is not made for someone to work in. It's a cloak kind of like my sports coat. You know, I would not, well, don't put it past me, but on a normal day, I wouldn't go work out in the field with the sheep in my sports coat. Now, I have been known to chase lambs that got out in dress clothes, but that's a special instance where they had to be brought in very quickly. But on a normal day, I wouldn't do that. Okay, so this coat, whatever it is, it can be a coat of many colors in your mind, I don't care. It can be long sleeve, tunic, or whatever. What it signifies is that Joseph is not someone who does manual labor. He's a spoiled brat. And that's kind of the character that you get before he's sold into slavery in chapter 30, later on in chapter 37. Okay, so another one might be that he follows the pattern of his father. Joseph tells his brothers that he had a dream, and he had two dreams. One of the dreams was of the sheaves bowing down to one sheave, and that signifies Joseph's brothers and his family all bowing down to him. He has another dream where there are 11 stars that bow down to the 12th, and the sun and moon are also bowing down, and that signifies then that his brothers are going to bow down. Now, it does bear mentioning here that although God has spoken to the patriarchs through dreams, He spoke to Melchizedek through dreams, He spoke through Pharaoh through dreams, He spoke to Isaac and Jacob through dreams, but none of those dreams had to be interpreted. All of those dreams were very point blank. The patriarch knew that he was talking to God. There was no interpretation that needed to take place. And here with Joseph, he has two dreams, both that have to be interpreted. And the question might be, why? why would God change His method? Why would God communicate in a dream that needed to be interpreted rather than just point blank tell Joseph what he needs to know? I don't have an answer, but I have a theory. And my theory is that God, as Scripture moves throughout time, God changes in order to reach those who He needs to reach in how history and time changes. Now, Joseph is going to wind up in Egypt. And Egypt was very much enthralled with dreams and dream interpretations. And so maybe it is, again, I don't have book, chapter, and verse, it's just my theory, but maybe it is that Joseph is learning now how to interpret his own dreams so that when he goes to Egypt, he can interpret dreams there, which he will, multiple times, for multiple people. And God will use that ability in order to help Joseph and ultimately help the people of God. So, maybe it is that he follows the pattern of his father. When Jacob and Esau are born, the prophecy there is that the older shall serve the younger, and here again you have the older who are going to serve the younger as given by that dream interpretation. And so Joseph does have these dreams, and in this time in the ancient world, dreams have meaning. You know, we think about sometimes going to bed and having a dream, and maybe it's a really lucid and vivid dream, and you wake up and you tell your spouse, boy, I had a really weird dream last night, and then you don't think anything else of it. In the ancient world, that was not the case. All dreams had meaning. And so Joseph's dreams would have certainly had meaning. Even today, and you can turn your nose up at this if you want to, but I'm just going to tell you what I've heard from people who have been there. Missionaries who work in the Middle East have great success by using dreams and dream interpretation. You don't have to believe it. But people in the Middle East believe very seriously that dreams have meaning. And evangelists there will use that to their advantage. And, maybe there's something to that. So, again, we talked about Joseph's dreams. When Joseph tells his brothers his dreams, his brothers decide that they're going to plot against Joseph. That's what kind of instigates the hatred even more. And so, his brothers go out and taking care of the flocks, and Joseph is sent by Jacob to go check on them. And so Joseph goes and he can't find them. They're not where they're supposed to be. And so he finally finds them in a new place, in a different place than what he thought. And they see him coming from a long distance away. And they plot and they say, you know what, let's kill him. We've had enough of him, let's kill him. Now that sounds very cruel to us, but think about it. Joseph has completely usurped the social hierarchy of the day. There's nothing good about what Joseph has done in their mind, and so they say, let's kill him. Reuben speaks up and says, no, don't kill him. Let's at least just kind of throw him in this empty cistern, and then we'll just see what happens. Now, Reuben says this so that when all the brothers had gone, Reuben can come back and rescue Joseph because he knows just how much Jacob loves Joseph. Well, Reuben's plan works kind of halfway. They throw Joseph in the cistern, and as they do, they see a tribe of Ishmaelites coming. In your English Bible, they're called Ishmaelites in one section and they're called Midianites in another. And the question might be, are we dealing with Ishmaelites or Midianites? And the answer is yes. The book of Judges talks about how the Ishmaelites and the Midianites are synonymous with one another, and so we shouldn't really worry about that too much. So Joseph's brothers then sell Joseph into slavery, and Joseph will eventually be taken to Egypt. Now, a couple of things to point out there. The first is that Joseph's brothers have now a character trait of responding in violence and rage to things that they have no business responding in violence and rage to. So remember Genesis chapter 34, when, I call her Dinah, but it's pronounced Dinah. When Dinah is raped, and the brothers say to Shechem and his people, you have to be circumcised. And while they were recovering from the surgery, the brothers killed all of them. Right? So they responded in anger and violence. Well, here, what's the proper response to Joseph? Well, I grew up with a little brother, and me and my little brother got in fights every now and then. And not too often because he's a lot bigger than I am and he would win. But we would get in fights every now and then. And usually once we fought, we were fine. That's kind of how brothers are. And so maybe the proper response is for Joseph and whoever else to kind of tussle it out. Maybe for them to put him in his place, so to speak, or whatever. I don't know. Maybe that's what the appropriate response was. The inappropriate response is to kill him and to throw him in a well or to sell him into slavery. They respond in violence and anger. Another thing to realize is the irony between what happened with Jacob and Esau and with Joseph and his brothers. When Jacob tried to trick Isaac, he did it by means of a goat. He put on a goat skin, and his father touched the goat skin and thought that it was Esau, but instead it was Jacob, right? It should not be lost on us, and I know it's hard for us to remember this because we've read and studied over and over, and a lot's happened since then. But now, the trickster who tricked his father with a goat is going to be tricked by his sons by means of a goat. And I think that the author does that on purpose, that there's an irony going on here because they're going to take Joseph's tunic and dip it in goat's blood. It's important that we realize when the Bible gives us details, it does so on purpose. And so it doesn't just say they dipped it in animal blood. It makes it very clear they dipped it in goat's blood. And that's something that we need to maybe think about. So the story ends, chapter 37 ends with Joseph going off into Potiphar's house in Egypt. And that leads us then to chapter 38. Now, chapter 38 pushes pause somewhat on the Joseph story and highlights a story about Judah. Now, the fundamental question of this story is why in the world is it even in the Bible? And we'll address that here in just a minute. But let me give you the Cliff Notes version of the story. Judah gets married, and he has 3 sons. And his oldest son, I think I have this right, that his oldest son marries a woman named Tamar. And he is evil. And this is the first time outside of the flood account that you have the Bible saying that because he was evil, God killed him. Now you have that happen somewhat quite often in the remainder of the Pentateuch and especially in the book of Judges. But here you have this son named Shua dying. And then you have Ur. Ur is the second son. And Ur is given to Tamar to fulfill the law of levirate marriage. Levirate marriage says that if you're a woman and your husband dies and you don't have children, then his brother marries you and gives you children so that his line will continue. Okay, so Ur is given to her for levirate marriage. And Ur, how can I say this tactfully? Ur takes all the pleasure of that relationship without any of the responsibility. Let's just put it like that. You can read your text and see what he does, and it's obviously ungodly because there he's supposed to bless her with children, but he realizes that the children won't be his, and so he enjoys the act but does not procreate. So let's just leave it at that. And so because what he did was evil, God kills him too. Now, Judah has one more son, but this son is relatively young and not quite ready for marriage, and his name is Shelah. And so Judah tells Tamar, when Shelah grows up, you can marry him and he'll give you children. But until then, go back to your father's house, that way you can be taken care of. Sounds noble enough. The problem is Shelah grows up and Judah doesn't do anything to marry the two together, to marry Shelah and Tamar. And so now Tamar has to take matters into her own hand. And she does so by dressing up as a prostitute. She hears that Judah is coming to town. She dresses up like a prostitute, meets Judah, and does what prostitutes do. She asks for some symbols from Judah. A seal and a staff and a cord, I think, are the 3. And that may not be right. I may have the facts wrong. But she asked for a series of symbols to identify that these are his. And they have a sexual relationship. She becomes pregnant. When it's found out that she becomes pregnant, Judah calls for her to be killed, to be burned. And then she shows the items and says, the father of the child is the one to whom these items belong. And then Judah makes a wonderful statement. He says to Tamar, you acted more righteously than I did. Because Judah's responsibility was to ensure that she had children to carry on her line and his line. And yet he never did. So, a couple of things to kind of point out here with this text is to answer the question, why is this even included in the Joseph Saga. What does this have to do with the Joseph story? If we're looking at it on a surface level, it has really nothing to do with Joseph's story. But I don't think that that's entirely true. First of all, it foreshadows the law of levirate marriage, which is going to come up in the law of Moses. And so here we get a tangible example of what levirate marriage is. You see this also in the book of Ruth, and of course we have laws in the law of Moses about it. Number two, it illustrates how Judah's former plan to thwart the older serving the younger simply does not work. Judah was part of the ringleaders that tried to get rid of Joseph so that the older wouldn't have to serve the younger. Well, that's exactly what happens with his sons. It's the younger who should have acted in place of the older. And so you can't thwart God's plans. I think that's a good theological point to make here. Number three, it provides information concerning the clans that belong to the tribe of Judah. Now think about it from a New Testament perspective. You know, Jesus is of the tribe of Judah, right? David is of the tribe of Judah. Now, of course, none of that was known, I suppose, outside of the inspiration of the Holy Spirit whenever Moses, who I believe to be the author of Genesis, was writing here. But it gives us background into the clans of Judah. And so whenever you go to like Genesis 46 and Numbers 26 and you see the lines of Judah there, it connects to Judah's beginnings, basically. I think, though, the reason this is included in our Bibles and the reason that Moses put pen to paper in the way that he did here before the Potiphar and Potiphar's wife and Joseph story is because the two contrast one another. Joseph encounters, and we'll see this in chapter 39, but Joseph encounters a woman who wants to have a sexual relationship with him that is unholy and unrighteous, and Joseph acts righteously and flees from that relationship. It cost him everything to do so, but he does. He acts righteously. In contrast, you have Judah, who needed to act in a sexual relationship in a righteous way in order to fulfill that righteousness, and yet doesn't. And so in one sense, you have the withholding of sexual relationships that is a righteous thing. In another, you have the withholding of a sexual relationship that is unrighteous. I think here we're supposed to see a contrast between Judah and Joseph. Joseph acts righteously in the realm of sexuality. Judah doesn't. And that's a great contrast. I think sometimes, and I want to be tactful in how I say this, but I think sometimes we in the church spend so much time teaching our young people especially how to refrain and refuse and flee from sexual temptation, that we also neglect to tell our young people that sexual activity within its proper confines is a wonderful and blessed thing. And I find sometimes that young people who get married have a hard first year because they've been trained their whole life to think that if I hold your hand in the car on the way to church, that somehow that's sinful. And it's a hard thing for these young couples to overcome. And I'm telling you that because you all have children or grandchildren who are young couples, and they need to hear it from you. They don't need to hear it from the pulpit necessarily. There's times and places for sermon and Bible classes. They need to hear it from you. And so there are times when sexual relationships are righteous. There are times when they are unrighteous. It's like what we said Sunday night about gluttony, that things that God created to be inherently good can be wrong in the improper context and in the abuse of those things. So we contrast and parallel chapter 38 and 39. I want to offer us a couple of theological points, some things that maybe we can take away from chapter 38, because chapter 38 isn't talked about hardly at all in Bible study or sermons or things like that. So the first is, again, to go back to that passage where Judah calls Tamar more just than himself. Your Bible may say more righteous or more holy or something. The Hebrew word there is sadak. And a variant of that word is used to talk about the priesthood. That you're holy, that you're righteous, that you're pure and clean. And now the question might be, well, wait a minute, didn't Tamar sin by deceiving Judah? Well, I don't want to overstep the bounds of the text. And the text never says that what she did was sinful. In fact, she acted in a very just and righteous way because she had to take matters into her own hand. This is a quote from a scholarly article, although I find it very readable and important here, about this. It says, Judah had been irresponsible and unfaithful to his duty to see that the family line continued through the levirate marriage of his son Shelah. Tamar fought for her right to be the mother of Judah's line. When she was not given Shelah and Judah's wife died, she took action on her own to ensure that the line did not die out. Though deceptive, it was a desperate and courageous act. And I think that's true. It was a desperate and courageous act. For Tamar, it was within her rights. She did nothing that the law did not entitle her to do, but for Judah it was wrong because he thought he was going to a prostitute. So, we kind of now have the matter of back to chapter 34, when Jacob fusses at his sons for killing Shechem and his men. Jacob says, you shouldn't have done that because that was, now we're going to have all the people against us. And that's not the right attitude to have, but murdering them also wasn't the right attitude to have. In this context, who was right and who was wrong? Well, Tamar was well within her rights to do what she did. And I think it's a wrong attitude for us to have, to be harsh against her and say, oh, well, she deceived Judah and therefore she was sinful. The text doesn't say that. The text puts her well within her rights. If anyone is sinful in this text, it's Judah. And of course, we're contrasting Judah with Joseph here. That brings us then to chapter 39. Chapter 39, we're back to Joseph, and Joseph is now in Egypt in the house of Potiphar. A couple of things to point out here, contextually and historically. You notice the picture. I usually don't talk about the picture. I just kind of put it up there for something visible to see. That is not an Egyptian. That is a Hyksos warrior. The reason I have that up there rather than an Egyptian inscription or a pyramid or something like that is because if we date Joseph the way I think Joseph should be dated, the Egyptians weren't even in power in Egypt at that time. It's the one time in all of Egyptian history, outside of the Romans, when the Egyptians were not in power. The ethnic Egyptians weren't in power. The Hyksos came into Egypt and absolutely annihilated Egypt. And the reason they did is because the Hyksos, they didn't develop it, but they perfected the use of archery from horses. Before then, you would have your archers kind of standing behind the front lines, behind the infantry, and they would shoot arrows over the infantry from a stationary point of view. The Hyksos perfected the ability to ride horses and be archers on horseback, and to ride in chariots and be archers from chariots. And that changed the course of war. Because now you can have an effective way to shoot, where you can aim and shoot from a distance, but also do it while moving. So the Hyksos completely obliterated Egypt and annihilated Egypt. Now the issue with that is, if you look at this inscription, what does this Hyksos warrior look like? He looks like an Egyptian, right? I've always found it funny, at least as long as I've studied this, to kind of ask the question, who defeated who? Because even though the Hyksos won and the Hyksos ruled for a time, a short time, but for a time, they adopted Egyptian culture. They dressed like the Egyptians. They spoke the Egyptian language. They learned hieroglyphs. They practiced Egyptian law. So who really won the war? Egyptian culture didn't die out at all. And so that's very important for two reasons. Number one, when we come to Exodus, in Exodus chapter 1, one of the most important verses there says that there arose a Pharaoh in Egypt who did not know Joseph. Well, Joseph was second in command in Egypt. How in the world could you not know Joseph if you're in Egypt, an Egyptian Pharaoh? Surely you would have known that. Not if the Hyksos were in power, right? Then you wouldn't know anything because maybe they didn't keep records, or the records that they did keep you don't want because that shows a weakness in your country and your culture. So, a lot of good evidence to suggest that. So that's number one. Number two is that when we come to Genesis 39, we meet Potiphar. We met Potiphar at the end of chapter 37, but Potiphar now is here in chapter 39. And Potiphar is always called the Egyptian. It's Potiphar the Egyptian, Potiphar the Egyptian. And I don't know about y'all, I have a very common sense way of reading the Bible. I know it doesn't seem like it because I get deep quick, but the common sense in me says, duh, you're in Egypt, of course he's going to be an Egyptian. Not if the Hyksos are in power. If the Hyksos are in power, it's very important that we know that Potiphar is an Egyptian. Right? Because that separates him as the other. Okay? And so Potiphar is called the Egyptian, and that, I think, is why. He's also called a eunuch. Now this is very important for chapter 39. When we think about eunuch, particularly like we think about them in the role of Esther, a eunuch is very simply a castrated male. However, the Hebrew word, and for that matter the Greek word for eunuch, that does signify a castrated male, does not always and often doesn't in the Bible signify a castrated male. Instead, it better signifies a nobleman. There is nothing in the text to lead us to believe that Potiphar was a castrated male. Of course, I highly doubt that he was, because he had a wife. And the reason that you have castrated males is so that they can serve in a court of women without being sexually tempted. Right? That's what you have in Esther. Okay? The Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8. He was in the court of Candace. He could have been a castrated male, although I don't believe that he was. And the reason is because he was in Jerusalem for a Jewish holiday approaching the temple, to which you could not enter if you were a castrated male. So I think the evidence lies that he's just a nobleman of sorts. Potiphar here seems to me at least, to be just a nobleman, someone who is in that political court and just set apart in that way. Very important person. Okay. When the Bible gives us a physical description, we need to pay attention. The single most important person in the history of ever has no physical description. Jesus has no physical description, but Joseph does. And Joseph's physical description is that he's a good-looking boy. He is called handsome and maybe beautiful in some senses. The same Hebrew phrase in verse 6 is used in Genesis 29 and verse 17 of Rachel. And Rachel is Joseph's mother. So the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Rachel was a beautiful person. Joseph's a beautiful person. And that's important because Potiphar's wife is going to be sexually tempted by Joseph. And she's going to try to act on those temptations. She's going to call to Joseph over and over and over again to get him to go to bed with her. And Joseph continues to refuse. It's not a one-time thing. It's over and over and over again. And Joseph refuses. Now, when it finally gets so much, Potiphar's wife, she begs and begs and begs. And then she grabs on to Joseph, and as he's leaving, she takes the cloak off of him, and he flees without the cloak, and she's left there with a piece of what she will call evidence that he tried to rape her. That's basically where the story is headed. Now, Joseph's fleeing from, can we call her a temptress? I think that's a pretty good word. Joseph's fleeing from this temptress has often been used in parallel to Proverbs. In Proverbs, particularly chapters 1 through 8, you have Solomon there telling his son, or maybe in a proverbial sense, anyone who reads, that you are to flee from Lady Folly and pursue Lady Wisdom. And Lady Folly is the harlot that lies around the corner with honey dripping from her mouth, and she's dressed in scarlet. And I mean, boy, she's a cute little thing, you know. I mean, she'll tempt you to death. But it's Lady Wisdom to whom we must cling and who we must pursue. And so this has been in rabbinical tradition and in Christian tradition likened to that and used as an illustration for that. Now, the text never does that, but I find it kind of interesting here in chapter 39. Now, in verse 14, Potiphar's wife has the garment of Joseph, and she tries to accuse him of rape. Now, what verse was that? Verse 14. It says, she called for her household servants and said to them, "See, my husband brought in a Hebrew man to humiliate us. He tried to go to bed with me, but I screamed loudly." Now, two things of note here. First is that she says, my husband brought in a Hebrew man. Well, why is that important? Hebrew, at this time, is not a designation of a people group. At this time, especially in an Egyptian light, would mean a homeless wanderer, like the Bedouin, a homeless wanderer. Hebrew at this time is, for lack of a better term, a racial slur. It's something negative. You know, it's a slander. Okay, there's a stone. I should have put it on a picture here. There's a stone called the Merneptah Stela, and if you want to Google that, I highly encourage you to do it. But it's a telling of the conquest from King Merneptah against three people groups, and there's two hieroglyphs there that signify a nation, and then you have the Hebrews under that, or the Hapiru. And then you have the hieroglyph for a nomadic people. Now, the Hapiru are not the same as the Israelites. They're Bedouin nomads. Okay? But I say that to bring about, this is kind of a racial slur. And the second thing is the word humiliate in my Bible. I don't know how your Bible translates it. Some English translations say to make sport of, and I guess that's a fine translation. But the meaning underneath the word is that she's claiming that Joseph was going to rape her. That's really the meaning here. And so she's accusing him of rape in a sense, and she has his garment, and she shows that to Potiphar as proof that happened. And Potiphar then is very hurt because we kind of skipped over this, but Joseph has grown to be second in Potiphar's house, only under Potiphar. Now, the text says that Potiphar did not worry about anything at all except the food he was going to eat. Everything else was left in Joseph's charge. So it seems to me that Potiphar and Joseph have a very good relationship, and Potiphar is saddened by this, but he has to act. He has the word of his wife and the word of Joseph. And as much as we admire Joseph in his context, Joseph is just a slave. He's a foreign slave. And so the word of his wife is obviously going to be more important. He sends Joseph then to jail. And jail is maybe not the right term here. I'm not entirely sure how to describe where Joseph was. Dungeon, perhaps. The place where people who give serious offenses against political officials go. And usually it's to await your death. And so that brings us then to chapter 40. It does bear mentioning here, I want to say this before I skip over it. One thing that we can take as a theological truth is that Joseph is able to show the power of honoring God even when the consequences aren't favorable. It would have been very easy for him to just do what Potiphar's wife said, and that to be their little secret. But he doesn't. He acts honorably, and he honors God like we talked about Sunday night. He honors God with his body by not falling to those kinds of temptations. Okay, chapter 40 then. This will be the last thing for tonight. We're almost out of time, so I'm going to go ahead and put everything up. Okay. Chapter 40. Joseph's in prison, and he's in prison there with the cupbearer and the baker. I think sometimes we read this and kind of overlook the significance of these people. It's not just the waiter for Pharaoh. It's not just someone who worked in the kitchen. These are very important positions. So the Hebrew term for cupbearer is probably the same as the Egyptian word weve, and in Egyptian you have an E sound in between the vowels most of the time. And so this is probably an Egyptian official who was a confidant of the king and wielded political power. When we teach this in Vacation Bible School, we often say, well, this is the person who handled the food for the king and made sure it wasn't poisoned so the king didn't die. Okay, perhaps, but when you're doing that for the king multiple times a day, you kind of become buddies with the guy. And you become sort of a liaison and confidant. And so that's the position that the cupbearer is in. It's more of a political power than just a waiter. Now, the same way with the baker. The baker may have been the Egyptian reteti, who served as head of the bakers and might have held privileges in the royal court. Both of them are called saris in Hebrew, and saris again is the word for eunuch. And I don't think these are castrated males. I just think they're noblemen. They're people of prominence. They're people of high power. We don't have, you might think with all the hieroglyphs in Egypt that we have all kinds of historical text from Egypt. Yeah, kind of. Not really. Most of what we have from Egypt in text are recipes. Can you believe that? We have cookbooks. And a lot of the cookbooks are how to bake different kinds of breads. So I like to think that this baker might have one day written a cookbook. I don't know. Maybe so. Now, the cupbearer and the baker both have dreams. Now remember, Joseph is a dream interpreter. He has the ability to interpret these dreams. And so they tell the dreams. And the dreams have to do with whether or not they will be freed or not from the prison. And so Joseph interprets the dreams. And the way that he interprets them, of course, you can read chapter 40. We're running out of time, so I'm trying to speed ahead. You can read how those work out. And Joseph interprets these dreams, and they come to pass just as he interpreted. And Joseph says, when you meet Pharaoh, tell him about me. You know? Make mention of me. You ever heard it's not what you know, it's who you know? Well, prime example. But Joseph is forgotten about for quite some time, and we'll see in chapter 41 where Joseph will have the opportunity to interpret a dream for Pharaoh. Perhaps the most important part of this is that Joseph does prove himself as a dream interpreter. As we close, one final thing about being a dream interpreter. We mentioned in passing earlier that in Egypt, dreams were vitally important. And you have to remember, too, that in Egypt, everything is a god. I mean, the Egyptian pantheon of gods is nuts. And the gods communicate with humanity in Egyptian mythology in all kinds of ways. I mean, the fact that you get on a boat and drift down the Nile, and if you're drifting at a certain speed, that might be a god talking to you. I mean, it's anything. Right? And so the fact that Joseph can interpret dreams and interpret dreams that make sense and has a track record of the dreams coming true is vitally important to set him up for where he's going to be.